Chris Yandex, CYInterview, covering Las Vegas and the world. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button below and like this video to keep up with everything we have going on here at CYInterview in Las Vegas and beyond. We greatly appreciate it. Today, we have a treat for you. The 1983 World Series of Poker main event winner and, of course, a Poker Hall of Famer, Tom McEvoy, is here to talk about his new book, which you can find on Amazon in a variety of different ways. It's called Poker Pioneer. It was released in June of 2024 last year. Tom, thanks so much for being on CYInterview. It is such a delight to have you here with us today.
My pleasure. And I love talking about my book as well as other topics too, whatever.
Oh, absolutely. We're going to talk.
Yeah.
I mean, it's 500 pages. There's a lot there, obviously. But why don't I just start with this and then we'll talk about the book. I mean, you win the World Series of Poker in the 1980s. Is it fair to say that what made a good poker player back then is different with today's poker world?
I would say some of the same characteristics are necessary now as back then. In the World Series back then, it was a lot fewer events. And in fact, in 1983, the year I won the main event, I won 2 bracelets that year because I won the Limit Hold'em, which was, at the time was the second biggest event. And so I won 2 out of the 14 events they held that year. Nothing like the 99 bracelets or 100, whatever the final number is for this year. So the difference in the poker world is vast, but the skills necessary, I think, are still very pertinent today as they were back then. And when I decided to become a professional poker player, it was not the popular thing to do back then in the 1970s. In fact, my own parents thought I'd lost my mind. I was making the biggest mistake of my life. And I said, I'm going to move my family, my 3 children, my wife, out to Las Vegas and play poker. They thought I was insane. And that was the mutual opinion of almost everybody I talked to and told them about it. They thought I'd lost my mind. They think I'd be back within 6 months with my tail between my legs and so forth. Even the players in my home poker game, which I was destroying on a weekly basis, thought I was crazy. You know, being your buddies at home was one thing. Going to Vegas and playing with professional players, different story. And that's why they used to call, maybe they still do, Las Vegas is the graveyard of hometown poker champions. But not all hometown champions fail. And I was one of the exceptions that proved the rule that some of us are going to make it. And I was one of the lucky ones that did. But I was very dedicated and willing to do whatever it took to survive. And I never did have to go back to the corporate business world. After I'd worked for 12 years as an accountant in various companies, and I basically turned in my pencil, and that was it. I never went back.
Do you think that your background in accounting helped you become a great poker player, and then in all those other areas besides being a poker player that you also got into in the industry itself?
Absolutely. Yeah. I've forgotten more about accounting than I can remember, but my original goal in life was to be a certified public accountant. But I left public accounting before I took the CPA exam, which at the time I believe I could have passed. So I never did get to be a CPA. And if I had stuck to accounting and become a CPA, I almost for sure would have gone down a totally different path and a much less interesting one for sure. But my true destiny was poker, as it turned out, which I had no clue about, obviously, until necessity forced me to take a chance on myself.
How did your life change after you won the 1983 World Series of Poker main event? Did you have a new level of confidence? Was it another day at the office? And how many entrants were there then?
Back then, they had 108. Now, that's nothing like what they got now, where they have over 10,000. So we had 1% of the field, the current field back then. 108 was the record at the time. And that kept getting broken almost every year. They increased it. there was no such thing as dead money at that tournament. It was almost all top pros, dominated by Texans, but there were some European players came too. Some of the best, couple of top players from Ireland were there. One of which, Donica O'D, made the final table of the main event. He was also second to me the week prior when I made when I won my limit hold'em bracelet. So he was the guy I played in the finals. And he blamed me and said it took him about another 20 years before he finally won a bracelet. He finally did win one, but he blamed me. Anyways, he's a really good guy, and he's still active as a player. I see him every year at the World Series. He comes out still. But it was a totally different era back then. Everything was, at the Horseshoe downtown on Binions. And when you were playing, it was very seldom there was more than one or two players at the table that you hadn't met before or played with before. Now, it's very rare if I find anybody I've ever even heard of at the same starting table at any of the World Series events. It's gotten so much bigger. Can you imagine? It was like 14 events back then. Now, like there was 100, and then that's not even counting the bracelets they give away in other areas, in Europe and so forth.
Oh.
So the contrast, you couldn't even imagine it. Even the most progressive, optimistic players never could have seen what happened to poker, where poker players actually became like media stars in a lot of cases. People like Doyle, of course, Negreanu and Helmuth being the most obvious examples that their influence and fame has spread way beyond just their activities in the poker world.
Oh, no denying that. But here's what I'm going to ask you in that regard. So after you win the main event, you become one of these early guys who's like, well, I could make money in poker, not just by being at the table. I could write how to be better at poker books. And then obviously you also got involved in running poker tournaments. So how did the guys feel when you started writing these books about how to get better at poker? Did they feel like you were bringing in this whole new generation of people, and thus the fields were going to expand and the secrets weren't the secrets anymore? What was the reaction to that?
Well, that's kind of interesting. Even after winning these two events at the World Series, I became very famous in poker, which was a much smaller world back then, overnight, virtually. And 4 months after I won those two World Series bracelets, I went over to Ireland, where Terry Rogers hosted the only European tournament at the time in Dublin. And I won the main event there 4 months after I had, captured the two bracelets at the Binions at the World Series. So it was a cool, totally different era. I never thought about writing a book. That was the last thing. I didn't even occur to me to write a book. By the way, there was absolutely at that time not one book anywhere about the World Series. Doyle Brunson had come out with his super system, which wasn't called that originally. Originally, it was called How I Won $1 Million Playing Poker. And that came out in 1978. And before I'd moved to Vegas, which was I arrived for good July 4th weekend of 1979, same weekend they opened Vegas World, which has now become the Strat. But for a year, between my last accounting job ended in May of 1978. For 1 year, I flew back and forth for staying for various lengths of times, anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks at a time, testing the poker waters. And I heard about the new book that Doyle had written, so I said, well, I got to get this book. It was $100 back then. This was 1978. $100 for a book was quite a bit back then. But I said, well, I got to get this book. So I found out he had a publishing company, which briefly, anyways, for a year or so, and I tracked it down. And So I decided to go in there and just buy the book. So there's only one person sitting there. When I walked in the office, it was Doyle. I said, the man himself, you know. So I introduced myself, hi, and I said, I would like to buy your book. And he's always happy to, you know, autograph it and be gracious. And then I did something that's a little uncharacteristic for me. I wrote about this in my book, my autobiography. I pointed my finger at him like this, not in a mean way and not in his face. We were several feet apart. I said, one of these days, I'm going to be at the same table with you. You just wait and see. And he's heard that a million times, I'm sure, from other people. But in my case, it actually happened. So now, what does all this lead to? Well, I hadn't thought about, so I bought his book, obviously. I studied it. I read through it multiple times. And what people don't realize is that in 1983, when I won the World Series main event, Doyle Brunson made the final table and came in third. And everybody thought he'd win his third main event title, that he was the big favorite. But myself and the runner-up Rod Pete, we had a different plan, as it turned out. But anyways, Doyle came in third. That was the last year he made the final table of the main event. Now, he won other events and other bracelets after that. So back then, winning the main event was nothing like it is now, or $12 million, you know, for first place. It was the year I won, it was paid $540,000. And that's big money back then, even, you know, even now, that's a nice chunk of change, but back then it was even more. But there's a lot of stories about that. I only had about a third of myself by the time the smoke cleared between deal making and pieces sold, so forth. So that, but I knew after I won the main event, I went from being obscure to overnight. Now I'm getting written about in all the papers that covered the poker scene, which was a fraction of what there is now. But I knew my life would never be the same. It never was. Did I think about writing books? No, didn't even enter my mind. What happened at one of the magazines called Gaming Today, which is still around, I believe, the owner of it, a guy by the name of Stanley Solitikoff, contacted me, and at the time, Mike Carroll, the Mad Genius, was associated with him, and they both approached me, excuse me a second, and asked me if I would be interested in writing a book. I said, on poker tournament strategy. There was nothing at all written in Doyle's book or anywhere on poker tournament strategy. So I had to think about it for a bit. I said, wait a minute. I said, you know, I mean, I had my own theories. When I won the main event, I had less no-limit hold'em experience than probably anybody in the field. But I played a lot of limit poker, and I've been playing every little tournament I could find for the last several years. Ever since I came to Vegas and started coming on a regular basis in 78 and moved here in 79, I was playing small tournaments all the time around town. There weren't as many as there are now. Like you find tournaments multiple locations daily. Back then, they'd have maybe one a week at a particular casino, and others would have one a week. And I would play every one I could find. The first two tournaments I ever played, I had a first and a second, and that hooked me on tournament play. So I was developing my own strategies, nothing I had written down, just, you know, it was all up here. And when they approached me to write the book, I said, well, I hadn't thought about it. I said, I finally decided I'd give it a try. And because I said nothing at all written on tournament strategy. So I did. And I knew I needed help with the book, so I recruited a guy who passed away a couple of years ago, Roy West, to co-author it with me. And in other words, I basically dictated the book into a tape recorder. And then he transcribed it, and then we reviewed it and made sure the material was the way I had it outlined and planned. And the book retailed for $9.95. And that made no money at all, because I had agreed to pay Roy West out of my own pocket $5,000. And if I recovered that much in royalties, I'd split whatever after that with him. I never made anywhere near that. By the way, when I cough a little bit, because I talk a lot and I forgot cough drops, silly me.
It's okay, don't worry. It's fine. Great stories.
So I do this book. It's a pretty basic book, but at the time was the only thing out there. So I don't make any money on the book, lose money, in fact. Don't even get paid all my royalties. Slotikoff, who published other things besides the Came In Today, was not doing very well financially. So even my few royalties, I didn't fully get. All right, so that was a negative experience as far as making any money. I thought, well, okay, well, it is what it is. I forgot about writing books. I didn't do another book for 10 years. And the reason the second book came about, a lady moved from Bakersfield, California, had written a couple of books herself under the name of Shane Smith. Her real name was Dana Smith, but she didn't feel a book written by a woman would sell as well. So she used Shane as her pseudonym. And she moved to Las Vegas with the express idea of starting her life. She'd just gone through a divorce and stuff. So she wanted to get her life on a new track. But she also, because she had written a couple books on her own, wanted to track me down and see if I would have an interest in writing another tournament strategy book. She had written the second book ever written about tournament strategy, and she called it Tournament Tips from the Pros. And I was heavily quoted in there, as was Doyle and a lot of the other top players. So there was a lot of tips on tournament poker in the book. It was a pretty good little book at the time. And it was, I said, other than my original book from 10 years before, there was nothing written on it. So she ran into me just by random. I was in a poker room, of course. I was going to the Mirage at the time to play. And I ran into her, and she stopped me and said she would be very interested in working with me on another poker tournament strategy book if I had an interest. I thought, well, I didn't know her, who's she? I mean, she's Bakersfield. I was familiar with the fact that she had written a couple books, but since I didn't make any money in the last one, I was damned if I was going to write another book if I couldn't make any money. So I kind of brushed her off. I said, I don't think so. And then I just forgot about it. Well, I run into her again 6 months later. And at the time, I'm basically going through hard times financially. And I had just been divorced a few years prior. That wiped me out completely. So I was like not doing well financially. At this time, she had a business plan. And she says, Tom, I think we can make around $25,000 if we do this book. And she had it all written down and stuff. I said, well, at the time, that sounded pretty good. So I said, all right, but we're going to do it on my schedule, my time, my this, my that, and so on and so forth. She agreed to all that. I said, okay, fine. So I started doing the same thing, dictating the book in the tape recorder, except it was a mishmash. I started out with Raz of all games, because I decided to do the book similar to Doyle's book, covering every game that they had a World Series event for. Like Doyle did with his super system. He covered multiple games, not just Nolan's home. So I started doing that, and she said, basically, you idiot, this is totally unacceptable and no good at all. It didn't flow, nothing. And she was right. She didn't actually call me an idiot, but that was the message. You know, you kind of read between the lines. So I said, okay, all right. So I said, I actually did figure out what we need. I said, we need an outline, and I will try to restructure this, and that's what we did. We made an outline together, and then the book flowed. And I thought we were going to do it at my time, my speed, blah, blah, blah. Once I got into doing it, now I wanted to get it done, because it took 5 months to write this book, which was a lot longer than the first one I did with Roy West. So after we got into it for a while, I was thinking to myself, you know, this book is pretty good. You know, I mean, it's nothing like Super System, perhaps, but there's some similarities, and it's about tournament structure and so forth, and tournament strategy, and there's nothing out there on it other than the one I'd written 10 years before, which is useful but nothing special. And I always knew I could do better than that. So we get the book. It takes 5 months rather, before we actually have it in print, which comes out like March or so of 1995. This was 1994 when she had approached me. And I kept saying, you know, is this book as good as I think it is? Because I thought it was pretty good, and it was. And we self-published. We sold ourselves. There was no middleman, and you know, we retailed it for $40. I even did 200 limited edition of hardcover copies of it, which we sold for $60. We sold them all out. So we sold out the whole printing. So her guesstimate of how much I would make on the book was $25,000. I stopped counting after we'd made over $100,000. I lost track. You know, I just reported whatever my income was on my tax return. I don't even remember how much we made specifically on that book. So that book went extremely well and made a lot of money for me, and took a lot of the pressure off me financially. Now I'm kind of basically solvent again, and it got a lot of favorable publicity. And I felt, you know, I did a good job, and I liked the idea that I could actually make some money doing this, which I'd never before, after my first experience, thought was even possible. So anyway. So what's the logical thing we do next? Oh, we write another book. Okay, so what should we do this time? Well, I was casual friends with T.J. Cloutier, and he was at the time probably the #1 tournament player in the world at that time, and he was a fantastic no-limit hold'em player. And at the time, when I first came to Vegas, limit hold'em was the main game. They didn't even spread no limit hold'em cash games. The only time you played no limit was in tournament situations. But we played a lot of pot limit hold'em, which has similarities to no limit, but not the same. It's a totally different animal. So I played a lot of the pot limit, and so did TJ, as well as limit hold'em and occasional no limit hold'em tournaments, which were few and far between back then. That's totally different now, of course. Anyway, we approached TJ and asked him if he would have an interest in co-authoring a book with the three of us. You know, with Dana being the editor and TJ and I doing the book. And he thought about it, and I told him, you know, we did really well with the tournament poker book, and I said, you're like one of the biggest names out there. People are going to be very interested in anything you have to say about no limit based on your success. And he agreed. And plus, I said we weren't really close friends, but we were, you know, casual friends, and always polite to each other, and you know, hi, how you doing, that kind of stuff. Well, we developed a very strong, very close friendship working together. So next to my tournament poker book, this was the most successful one we did. And we're, again, self-published, so we have no middleman. We split everything a third each, Dana a third, me a third, TJ a third. And the book sold really well. And it was just as almost maybe even more popular. I'm not sure because I said I don't remember all the exact numbers. But we made a lot of money with it. I said, Jesus. So we thought about maybe we can collaborate on something else. So we just, there's no real Omaha books out there. So at the time, there are now, of course, but there was a few things written on it, but nothing major. So now we did an Omaha book, and that sold well too. We wound up doing 4 books together, and our trajectory of our lives changed because of this. Now, this is not something I could have even conceived, much less planned out in advance. So if it wasn't for Sludikoff originally contacting me to do that very first book, and Dana not giving up after I brushed her off the first time, we did all these other books together. And I wound up with doing 4 books with TJ. I did a couple with Brad Doherty. I did one with Max Stern and Linda Johnson on Stud, Raz, and Stud 8 or better. We each took one of the games, and that was my least successful book I might add. I just couldn't. It just wasn't quite as well written as the others, and those games weren't as popular either. And then I did more Hold'em books and tournament strategies and that kind of stuff. So I wound up doing, from never even considering being an author, I wound up writing 14 books. The 15th and final one was my autobiography, which came out last year.
Poker Pioneer, of course. So let me ask you, let me ask you this in this regard. I know you've won a couple $1 million, I believe, in tournament winnings lifetime. Did you make as much money from all the books as your poker? Did you do better? Was it about the same? How would you rate that?
Oh, I made a lot of money selling the books, all right, but nowhere near as much money as I made playing poker. In fact, I made jokes. I said, I'll die a winner in poker because the amount of money I won at poker, well, I don't have it anymore, so I can't lose back what I don't have. So my financial difficulties, none of them came from poker or gaming. None of it. I used some extremely poor judgment in people I trusted. Getting divorced didn't help any, of course, either. And I basically had to start all over from scratch more than once, from zero. After winning after winning the main event, I would bust more than once and kept climbing back. You know, I just didn't give up. I don't have a quit in me. That's one of the reasons. And I had enough ability to overcome this. So also the other thing, here's what I didn't have. I didn't have bad habits with drugs or alcohol or anything like that. No substance abuse whatsoever. I hate drugs, hate cigarettes. Of course, I did help with a huge campaign to get smoking out of the poker rooms. That was successful ultimately. So because I didn't have bad habits in this area, I was able to overcome my own misdeeds and trusting the wrong people and making bad financial decisions. I mean, I tried investments and that kind of stuff. Everything I touched outside the poker arena failed, basically. And my so-called best friend at the time, so-called is right, caused me more damage than my worst enemy ever did, and financially, and havoc in my life. So my judgment at the poker table was pretty good. My judgment away from the poker table was not always as good. I think I'm much smarter now. I'm much more street smart. I was very naive and trusting. When I think back, how could I have been so stupid? Because I grew up in the Midwest. We're used to keeping our word, doing what we say we're going to do. And of course, I went on that assumption that when someone would tell me or make an arrangement to do something with me, that they'd keep their end of it, which proved to be a falsehood in a lot of, not every case, but in a lot of cases, enough to cause me a lot of permanent financial damage. But life is too short to go around hating people. Basically, I try to just forgive Not forget, but forgive damages that have been placed on me by others, and I try to forgive myself and for any damages I have caused other people, any hurt and pain, which we all at different times have hurt other people. Usually someone we really care about, really love you, and I've done that, and so. But to go around being, gee, I don't have what I used to have, being bitter about it, no, forget it. Life goes on. So,
good attitude. I agree. Let me ask you then. So moving forward, let's talk bankroll management. You're an accountant. Bankroll management. More money to be made if you're doing bankroll management, playing in tournaments long term, playing cash games long term, and hustling. What would you say would be the better profitable strategy for somebody with bankroll management?
some of the best tournament players in the world, like I used Daniel Negreanu, he was player of the year one year. The very next year, he lost a couple $1 million playing tournaments. The same success he had the previous year, gone the next year. If you're a really good tournament player, the fluctuations are enormous. The very best tournament players, and take any name you want, Helmut, Negreanu, Phil Ivey, any of them that are top-notch tournament players, they're not going to cash a tournament more than 20% of the time. They just aren't. So no matter how good they are, that means you got a failure rate of at least 80% or close to it. Maybe they'll run a little better for 1 year and cash 25% of the time or so. But overall, you're going to have an 80% failure rate. If you're a Major League Baseball player and get 3 hits in every 10 at bats, you're a 300 hitter, you're a superstar. Okay. If you can consistently cash tournament 20% of the time, you'll be right near the top of the tournament heap. But the fluctuations are tremendous. So you really have to have deep pockets and the talent and the ability and the mental capabilities of handling the swings. Very few people can do that. They may be talented players, but going through long dry periods where nothing works right, you start getting your sets cracked, or you have a flush or a straight, and someone makes a better hand at the river after all the money's in. There's nothing you can do about that. And in tournaments, the luck factor is much higher because you're always fighting against the clock, like a football team that's running out of time. If they're trailing, they have to do more high-risk plays. Well, you have to do that a lot of times in tournament strategy where you can't play a super solid game. The blinds are eating you up. You're going to have to take a chance. You're going to have to gamble on a few hands that you might not want to play earlier. So the fluctuations and the stress in tournaments are much greater than cash games, where you have a controlled situation where you can get up and quit any time, where you can't in a tournament. You don't start feeling very well, you start doing bad, too bad. If you leave the table, go ahead. Well, your chips are going to disappear because they'll blind you off. So in a cash game, you can control the amount of time you play. The one good thing about tournaments is that there's usually a fixed amount. You know that what your maximum downside is, unless there's rebuys. And if you're prepared to rebuy, then you factor that in too. But you always know in tournaments how much approximately you're going to have invested in this one particular event. A cash game, that's up to you. But at least you can quit anytime you want. And even the top players playing other top players, even the best ones in the cash games, they're going to do better than they do in tournaments. But they may not win more than 55, 60% of the time if they're playing really strong competition. Maybe a few. It's usually you might have 4 or 5 really good players in the game playing the high stakes, and maybe 1 or 2 that aren't so good, and those are the ones everyone's trying to feed off of, basically. So if you're playing smaller games against weaker players, you can have a 70% win rate in a cash game. And assuming you're a decent player yourself, of course, and you're not playing really strong competition. So that would be typical of most like 1-2 no limit games around town, 1-3 or the small limit games up through 8-16, for example, where most of the players aren't super strong. There'll be a few good ones, obviously, but not like if you're playing 1 in 200, for example. You'd be lucky if there's one guy in the game that's not so good. Even the weaker players can still play at a pretty high level. So it all depends on ego and bankroll on what you're trying to accomplish. Some people just, they know they're playing against players that might even be better than them, but they just love the action. They love playing against better players, which is what makes a poker game. Dewey Temple used to say the reason poker is so great is that everybody thinks they're the best player. A lot of people
That's good.
Mistakenly in my head. I never thought I was the best player, but usually when I sit down in a game, I might not win, but I figure most of the time, if I'm not the best player in the game, I'm close enough to the other 2 or 3 that might be decent players, where I can hold my own with them and crush everybody else. And of course, there's the luck factor. You know, if there wasn't a luck factor, poker wouldn't be much fun for a lot of people, because bad players can occasionally be good players just by catching better cards or drawing out on them, so forth. You know, I've done a lot of poker teaching over the years, and one of the things I keep telling people, I said, if you're playing correctly, don't expect the cards to break even, because if you're playing correctly, you're putting your money in with the best hand more than your opponents are, which means they're going to be drawing out more on you than you are on them, because you're not taking the worst of it as much as they are. So don't expect it to like just balance out. It doesn't work that way.
What is your advice? I'd love to say this to you. Obviously, a lot has changed since you moved here to Vegas in 1979, obviously, but is this still the place for somebody who wants to be a full-time poker player to move to, first? And secondly, what do you say to them who move here? Obviously, you would probably say have a full-time job, obviously practice and do tournaments when you're not working, try to improve your game, obviously. But I imagine, like, what would you advise somebody who has those dreams? Obviously, there are tens and thousands more players now playing in these tournaments. There's more people willing to take risks and chances, and as you say, just gamble more than ever, not play by the poker standards and rules. Of course, we call some of those players donkeys, I'm sure you know. The reality, though, of what it comes down to is, like, what do you say to young people today who have full-time poker pro ambitions?
Well, most people, I mean, the general advice that you would get from most people is don't do it. But putting that aside, you know, that's what I was told, and I ignored that. And I expect most people that want to give it a serious shot are not. They may be told not to do it, but they're going to take their chances anyway. So here's what I would advise. One thing, I really believe, to be successful at poker, first of all, you have to be smarter than the average guy. There's no such thing as a stupid guy that is successful at poker on a consistent basis. That doesn't exist. Most of the top pros would be very successful in other areas of their life if they chose to pursue them. So you have to have someone that, A, is willing to learn, B, has a native intelligence, and C, has to have enough discipline to avoid some of the things I did that were so stupid as far as managing my money. You would think as an accountant I would have done a better job than I did, but I screwed up trusting, I said, the wrong people, making bad investments, and not many things. I got long stories about that. But what I would tell them, if they're really going to be serious, you have to have enough of a bankroll where you can survive for 6 months would be the minimum. A year would be more likely. Enough to live on for a year, because your poker money is separate from your living money. If you just combine it, then if you're like gambling with your rent money, that's usually not going to work out too well. So you have to have enough of a cushion where wherever you earned that money before or inherited it or whatever you did to get it, you have to have enough to survive for a minimum of 6 months, and that's just taking a shot. But you really need enough for about a year so you can handle the fluctuations. If you're not a winning player, it doesn't matter because you're not. In the end, they're going to nail you anyways. So you're eventually going to go broke. But you got to be willing to learn from your mistakes. You have to dedicate yourself. I always said you got to be dedicated to the point of fanaticism if you want to really make it as a poker player. If you're dead certain that you think you have the ability to do it, and are willing to put the effort in, to think playing poker, that sounds like a lot of fun. Well, it is a lot of fun, but if you're trying to survive, make a living off of it, it's a business first and foremost. You have to treat it like a business, and not just say, it's just fun and games. Now, some of these guys with a lot of money that play high stakes, if they lose, so what? They don't care. But if you have to really rely on poker for your income, you better be very careful on your money management, things I made mistakes on, which I wrote about in the book, I might add, what not to do. So loaning out money, which has got me in a lot of trouble, is usually a very bad thing to do. Keeping your word, I think, is critical. If poker players' word is no good and they go broke and are trying to get a stake, they're going to have a much harder time if they, so he's not trustworthy. Why should I help him out? So if you borrow money or have an arrangement with someone that, like for sponsorship or even partial sponsorship, make sure you keep your word. I used to loan people money just so they'd go away and not bother me, because I know once you loan somebody some money, they would just avoid you unless they were faithful and repaying when they said they would. So if you owe somebody money, you avoid them, right? So they would go away and stop bothering me. That's a pretty stupid and expensive way to get rid of people that you are not desirable in your life. So.
Okay, so let me ask you, let me move forward here. So do you believe anybody who's never had any tournament success whatsoever, they say, I've won millions of dollars playing poker, but they have no record in any of the major tournaments. They've never been to a final table of any WSOP event. Do you believe those people, or do you believe that's just a bunch of hogwash?
I think they are deceiving themselves. It's also, with these big World Series fields, it's not unusual to go long stretches, but as an accountant, I always was meticulous with my record keeping. That's why I know where I screwed up and what games I did the best in and what tournaments. To this day, I keep completely accurate records. So there's no kidding. People, they tend to remember some of their successes, but they kind of blank out some of the things that didn't go well. Can't do that. You better know exactly what you're doing. So you have to keep records on your cash game play as well as your tournament play. And if you're not cashing more than, say, 5% of the time in tournaments, you're a losing tournament player. Excuse me. So one of my best friends, I'm not going to mention his name, but he keeps thinking he's just running bad. Well, he's been running bad for 10 years in tournaments, I'm talking about. And he has his own philosophy and thinking. We argue poker all the time. His approach is so different from mine. And he won't listen to me. He just is convinced he's on the right path, but the results don't show it. Well, he's kidding himself. But he's my best friend, so who am I to, as long as he's not jeopardizing his financial situation, he has enough money for the stakes he plays, or if he's not winning, it's not going to ruin him financially. But he's not a winning player, and hasn't been, and never has been. But he thinks he's playing right. Now, there's a lot of people like that, that have some success. Yeah, no one loses all the time. Even the bad players are going to win once in a while. So if you even have marginal skills, you're going to win some of the time, and that's always a success. Little successes, even they encourage people, but reality is quite a bit different. He says, "Oh, you're being negative." Okay, well, it may sound negative, but I think it's more like I'm being realistic. So. Yeah, you have to approach this with your eyes wide open. The biggest problem everybody has is themselves. They got to control themselves first. They have to have the ability. See, that was part of it with him too. His ability is not as high as he thinks it is, and I know that. But he's okay playing mediocre players and stuff. But if he starts to play bigger stakes against better players, no, he's a fish out of water, And people, they don't want to hear that. He doesn't want to hear it, and so what can I do? I just encourage him and say, "Well, I hope you're right." And if he's doing something that I really think is wrong, I try to dissuade him. So, but it's tough. Everybody that plays poker thinks they know how to play, even when the results aren't there. And not everybody says they want to win, but they don't do what it takes to win. A lot of people.
I want to reflect back on you and, of course, Doyle Brunson, Johnny Chan, and some of the other greats from that era, of course, and today. But during your era, when you were at the top of your game, do you think that you and Doyle and all the bigger players and even the bigger players today, that they tend to bluff less, or do you think that's just a circumstance situation?
I think we bluff less, way less than what people think. But we read situations right. We know, people like Doyle and Chan, they're experts at sensing when someone is either weak or can't handle the pressure. That will fold a slightly better hand, when they'll do it. There's a lot of psychology involved, and Doyle and people like Chan and several others, Ivy, of course, and Negrano, they're expert psychologists. Negrano, he likes to talk people to death. He's constantly trying to engage people in a conversation. So I have a very simple situation when I'm at the same table with him. If he asks me something, usually about my chips or something, or I don't talk to him. I mean, other than if I'm not in the hand and he asks me a question, yes, I'll answer it and that kind of thing. But the best way to handle people like Negrano that are getting a lot of information off you by engaging in the conversation, just don't talk to them. You're not required to answer a question. Besides, poker players are notorious that if their lips are moving, they're probably lying about something at the table. That's not always the case, of course, but you're not always going to get a truthful answer anyways, but even that's information. So every time you answer a question from a skilled tactician, like Negrano is a classic example of a guy who gets a lot of information just by engaging people in conversations. You're better off keeping quiet.
Tell me about your contributions to poker as far as getting smoking off the poker tables, out of the rooms, in general, all those contributions.
The World Series went non-smoking for the first time in the year 2002 at the World Series. That's not exactly ancient history, although it might seem so to some of the younger players. Up until then, people could smoke at the table. There was more arguments over that. I realized a long time before we finally got it eliminated that there could be no compromise. You know, it had to go. It just had to go. A lot of the casinos were fearful that players would stop going to tournaments if they couldn't smoke. They didn't have to quit smoking. They just have to take it outside. That's all. Yeah, they're not going to quit playing poker because they can't smoke at the table. Believe me, it's just a lot of them threatened to do that, and they are all basically full of crap, because they didn't have to quit their nasty habit, but they just couldn't chain smoke at the table. Even T.J. Cloutier used to smoke all the time at the table. He thinks that getting smoking eliminated from poker rooms saved his life, because he started to have some attacks and fainting and that kind of thing, and it was all smoking related. And so he finally quit. And right about the time we got it completely outlawed, he completely quit. And he was a heavy smoker too, and he thinks he's alive today because he did. Otherwise, he most likely wouldn't have made it. Heart would have given out. So there was a lot of resistance from casinos and some of the players, but eventually the idea started to catch on. We were circulating petitions and going to management. It wasn't just me. I had several other people fairly prominent in the poker world doing that. We had big names signing our petitions, like people like Chip Reese and Doyle. Even in a lot of some of the people would sign the petition and then put in parentheses after their name, smoker. Even some of the smokers, they finally got through the idea. Of course, casinos were full of nonsense about thinking they were going to lose business. What happened was, once we finally got rid of it, more people came back. They couldn't stand it before. They were like me. Sometimes, I would have to quit cash games because I couldn't stand it. I was being, smokers on both sides. You can't even imagine now how bad it was. And people putting up with that nonsense. Everybody knows smoking is terrible for you to begin with. And if you're a non-smoker, it's a really disgusting habit because it stinks up your clothes. It's totally unhealthy. To this day, I can't understand why people want to start smoking. Some people have been smoking their whole lives and are addicted. I get it, but to start smoking now, when I've known 4 people that didn't smoke cigarettes, 4 that died from throat or lung cancer because they were subjected to secondhand smoke, even though they didn't smoke, either at home or at work or both. So if anybody thinks that they're immune to the effects of it, that they don't know what they're talking about. There's just too much proof to the contrary. But some people are going to do it anyways. It's like drinking too much. Some people become alcoholics. They can't quit.
But here's what I'm going to say to you, RB. A very enlightened person in the world of gambling and poker playing and high stakes, of course. So let me ask you a couple more to end up. Do you think that the tales that are told about poker winnings and poker stories, that many of these stories are overhyped in pop culture and people don't really know what really happened in a lot of cases?
Absolutely. You're spot on. Players tend to exaggerate. It might be a partial truth, but things that aren't hyped, that are true, that are kind of hyped, are the really weird proposition bets some of these people make. There's some incredible stories about prop bets that are true. A person like the regular world, regular meaning, maybe they play a little poker on the side, but they're in business for themselves or working in a regular job. They can't even fathom what these people do, the kind of betting the side bets they make, and living off gaming. You have to be extremely talented, either a handicapper if you're an expert sports bettor, or most of the successful professional gamblers, what I call them, that are poker players. So that is the one area where if you're good enough, you can overcome the luck factor and everything else. In the long run, you're rewarded for making correct decisions in the long run at the poker table. And you kind of are the same way in life, I think. There's a lot of similarities between a successful life and being a successful poker player. But
what do you think going forward? So now let's talk about your contributions. Besides, of course, winning the WSOP main event in 1983, you also had work running the tournaments at the WSOP. So tell me about that, and what do you think makes a good poker tournament, like a structure?
Well, it used to be, the tournaments used to be dollar for dollar, and sometimes the structure would be a little bit too fast for the amount of chips in play. Now that changed, and now for the first 30 years of the World Series main event, he's got 10,000 chips for your 10,000 buy-in. So that finally changed, and they started giving people more chips, more time to play. Poker was never going to catch on as a spectator sport until people could see the whole cards. I used to say that before they had the whole card camera. I said, people aren't going to be that interested in poker if all I can see is the end result of the hand without any of the strategy. And of course, some of the players were resistant to that too, of course, at the beginning, because they were afraid they were giving away too many secrets. Well, this is how you get new players. Poker is very successful because there's a lot of new blood coming in all the time. Well, so-and-so did it. Moneymaker did it. He doesn't seem any smarter than me. I think I could do it. Well, they have a point. Maybe they can. You just don't know. But I lost my train of thought. What were we talking about?
What do you think makes a good poker tournament in general? Like, what is the structure?
A good structure. I played a tournament last night at the Orleans. I went out in the 12th round. I didn't cash, but I went fairly deep in the tournament. But they start out with 30,000 chips, and the blinds are 1 in 200. But they do 20-minute rounds for the first couple hours of the tournament. So it goes up on a regular basis. But one of the reasons the World Series is so popular is that there is plenty of play to it in all the events. In the main event, you start with 60,000 in chips. In some cases, I think it's almost too much play because it takes too long. The older you get, your stamina is not so good anymore. So I can't play the same amount of tournaments or time at the table that I used to because I'm older now. And my stamina just didn't hold up. So I really paced myself at the World Series. But to me, they're the bench water. They're extremely well-run tournaments, extremely good structure. You go online and you look up a particular tournament you have an interest in, and they'll tell you exactly how many chips, the time limits, and so forth. So even the ones with a little bit faster time limit, they give you enough to play to start with. So people are getting a fair bang for their buck when they play the tournaments. So I think the World Series is always the benchmark. But a lot of other players, a lot of other casinos do extremely well with their tournaments. Wynn, for example, has next to the World Series, I think it's about the second biggest tournament in every December now. And they have very good structure, so the Venetian and so forth. But even the local tournaments, the daily tournaments around town, they're giving people a little bit more play. But tournaments that are going to take 12 or 13 hours that are one-day tournaments, that's a little bit much. Then they need to either reduce the amount of playing time or the amount of starting chips. You got to make it reasonable if you're going to do a one-day tournament. And if you're not going to do a one-day tournament, fine, then give them more time, more play. So they have to decide how long they want this tournament to last. And that's a factor in whether or not how many starting chips they're going to have, what the time limits are going to be. So,
go ahead. Last question for you. So let's just talk about it. So from 1979 to 2025, you're here in Las Vegas. You see the changing of the entire poker community going from 100 people to now tens of thousands in some of these World Series of Poker tournaments. But what do you think about what came of Las Vegas from 1979 to now? What is Las Vegas today? And being able to see the changes from the end of the mob era to the beginning of where we are now. What are your thoughts on where we are today?
Welcome to corporate America. The people like the Binions that had personal relationships with their customers, gone by the wayside, pretty much. It's all very corporate run. Bean counters that say, well, if we don't make a profit here, there's something wrong with it. Like as a staunch local, the fact that they started charging for parking, I thought was insane. Are you kidding me? You're taking the worst of it when you go in the casino to begin with, and now they want to charge you to park your car. I mean, that's just ridiculous. Things like that. The humanity, the personal touch is gone completely. It's nothing like when I started. And it'll never go back that way either. I don't anticipate that ever happening again. But a lot of the original casino pioneers, they've passed on now. I loved Benny Binion. I thought he was a fabulous character. He was really something. If a guy was broke or down on his luck, he'd feed him, sometimes give him money. Even if, not because they might have lost it in his casino, but because he's trying to have that human touch. That's why people love the Binions for doing that. Now, once Sister Becky got involved with her husband, Nick, that was not so good because they were from a different stripe, so to speak. But people like Jack Binion and Benny, they were one of a kind, very unique people. And there was other great pioneers in the poker industry, like Jackie Gone and his family. They're still active today. And so one of the Gone properties is South Point, and that's my favorite place to play because I think that's the most well-run poker room in town. With maybe the Wynn is comparable on the Venetian, but as far as for the caters to a lot of locals there, and the people are nice. The card room, I mean, it's a very nice, well-run staff. I love playing there. Then the average casino customer there in the poker room, they're much nicer for some reason out there. So even though some of the games are a little on the tight side, I'd say, not quite as much loose action, but it's just a more pleasant environment. Very well lit room, well run. Room between the tables. You're not crowded on top of each other like you are at the Bellagio and some of these other places. So, things like that. But the personal touch is just not the same anymore. It never will be again.
Finally, what do you want people to take away from your book, Poker Pioneer? And besides, poker champion, of course, and author, we also have to call you Professor of Poker, Tom McEvoy, for your lesson today.
That's true. I did something a little bit different in my autobiography. One thing, there's no strategy in there. It's all stories. But before I did the book, when I talked it over with Brad Smith, I said, we're going to do something different in this book than some of the other books out there by poker authors. We're going to tell the truth. and that means warts and all. That means I'm going to talk about my mistakes as well as my successes. For one thing, it'll be a little more believable. I think if people say, well, wait a minute, he screwed up here. Yeah, I did. And maybe I can learn from that, or maybe they can learn from that. So I tell you not only what to do to be successful, but what not to do. So that's, I felt, put it this way, from my perspective, there's not 1 ounce of bullshit in that book. Everything I said happened. And I didn't have to invent stories. You know, I had a lot of dealings with a lot of the biggest names in poker, and a lot of those stories are in there. And also, some of my opinion on some of these people is also in there from my personal experiences. So some people aren't going to be happy with what I had to say. They're not happy. And people like Johnny Chan, for example, he's not going to like anything in there. And David Skolansky, the same thing. He's done a lot of good things for poker, Skolansky, but he's also not a very good human being. Things like that. So I had to be a little careful on some of the things that I didn't want to get sued again. I've been sued before for things I said that I shouldn't have, maybe that were true, but it didn't matter. You're not supposed to say certain things without incurring a potential problem that they want to go after you. So, but there's, I couldn't put exactly everything in there, but most of the stuff I think is pretty interesting too. If they have any interest in kind of the history of poker, how it's evolved over the years, this book is all about that. It'll tell you, because I've had a very long career. I'm not ready to retire to a rocking chair yet either, so I'm still out there, not as much as before. I used to travel maybe 5 months out of the year for tournaments on the tournament circuit. I don't do that anymore. I'll make an occasional short trip maybe somewhere, but most of the time when I travel, it's usually to visit family or friends somewhere. I did get to visit Brad, my co-author, last year in Ohio, and they treated me very nice there. I'm kind of a decent-sized fish in a very large pond in Vegas, but I'm a whale in Ohio. They really fussed over me, and it made me feel pretty nice, actually. Yeah, because they don't get to play too often against any World Series main event player or Hall of Famer. So I was very well received. I said, well, Brad, when do you want me back? I'll be happy to do it again. Brad and I became very close friends. We're not just book partners, but we have a very strong personal relationship. And he wasn't sure he was qualified to do this autobiography, but he had written some other stuff about old, no longer in existence casinos in Las Vegas. And he had done a whole series of articles for the Casino Collectibles Association magazine. And I read these, and I said, I think you got a book here, Brad, if you wanted to pursue it further. I said, this is very well researched, very well done. I really like what you have to say here. And he said, well, thank you, and all that. And then I had tried starting my autobiography a couple other times, and I didn't get very far. I realized, just like I did with my first book with Roy West, that I needed someone there to do it with me. And he wasn't sure he was qualified. And I said, well, Brad, if you're willing to take a chance on you, I'm willing to take a chance on you. And he was absolutely the right guy. So I met the right guy at the right time, the right place, and it finally happened.
Well, I'm grateful that Brad was able to connect us today. And 1983 World Series of Poker main event champion and Poker Hall of Famer Tom McEvoy. Thank you so much for joining us today on CYInterview. Again, the book is called Poker Pioneer. You can find it on Amazon. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Chris. I enjoyed it very much. I'll be happy to come back anytime.
Oh, we can't wait to have you back, Tom. Thank you so much.
Take care.